Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's chat. My name is Tara, and I'm a team member here at Understood. Today, we're going to be talking about managing ADHD at home, and we're so excited to have Mark Griffin, PhD, joining us today. Hi, Mark, how are you?
Morning, Tara. Actually, I guess it is afternoon. I'm fine, thank you. Happy New Year, and it's great to be here and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that is helping kids with ADHD when they're not in classrooms, but at home in a totally different kind of environment and different set of conditions.
Absolutely. Happy New Year to you as well. Mark, would you like to take a moment just to briefly introduce yourself to the folks joining us?
Sure. I am a practitioner through and through. I've been in the field for over 40 years and am both a psychologist and a special educator. I was fortunate enough to start and lead a boarding and day school for kids with learning disabilities and attention issues in southern Connecticut. I'm a member of the board of the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and I am an expert consultant for Understood.org and the Poses Family Foundation. I think the most important part of me is that I've really had an opportunity to both work and really live with kids for 30 or so, 34 years before we graduated and went on to do other kinds of things. And that, I think, gives me an interesting perspective of seeing kids both in and outside the classroom, and certainly with parents and a close partnership with parents. And so it's been a great ride, and I think I've learned an awful lot of things from kids who are very good teachers.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Before we get started, I do want to remind the folks joining us that we will be taking questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat box, located on your screen. And it usually is helpful if you can be as specific as possible. Make sure to include your child's age so that Mark can give a more targeted response. So my first question for you, Mark, is why is it important for parents to be well informed about their child's ADHD?
Well, as we all know, and I'm certainly sure the audience knows, that kids with ADHD have a very complex existence. And so the more we can know about ADHD itself and how it is affecting our particular youngster, the better. It really is a team approach. When you look at any identification or potential identification of a youngster with ADHD, you want to look at so many different variables. I mean, we know that most kids with ADHD have executive function issues, so they have trouble organizing and planning and completing things and understanding how much effort has to be brought to things as well. But we also know things like a number of kids with ADHD are developmentally as much as 3 years behind, and so we have to look at what our expectations are for our 7-year-old when in truth, developmentally, he or she is operating as a 4-year-old, and we want to be sure about this designation or identification. There are lots of kids who are itchy, who are fidgety. There are lots of kids who we call little ditzy or spacey. We really need to be sure we gather enough information to see that the severity is there, the frequency is there, and over a period of time that the kinds of things that we associate with kids with ADHD are getting in the way enough or so much that this youngster can't function effectively. So we want to gather information from everybody. Certainly you want to find a very good medical professional to help you with this. You want to engage and collaborate with the teaching team if your youngster happens to be in school. If not in school, you want to engage with people who see your youngster in playgroups and in preschools and things like that. So you can begin to gather enough information to make sure that you're really talking about a disorder that is affecting you in a way that is difficult. You also want to gather enough information because if your child happens to be identified with it, there's some ramifications for extended families and how your other youngsters treat this particular youngster. You want to be sure they understand that it's not that you're giving this particular youngster in your family a pass, but that there are some things he or she really struggles with. So gathering as much information as possible. And we really suggest even sort of logging it, putting it in a place where you're looking at trends, you're looking at triggers, you're trying to connect the dots. There really are more dots than we think they are, and they can be connected. But it's like anything else any parent would do. The more you know, the more effective you can be in both understanding it and perhaps even more importantly, in partnering with your youngster to intervene effectively and help him manage the things that are likely to happen if he honestly and truly has ADHD. So the more information, the better, from the right people. They should be people who are both qualified and have enough exposure to your youngster so they can really tell you and help you understand how he operates under different sets of conditions. Kids operate very differently at home than they operate in the community, than they operate in school. And so all of that sort of information needs to come together in a very nice, as neatly package as you can get before you begin to consider whether this is simply a kid who, had a tantrum at 3. Well, most 3-year-olds have tantrums, so it's okay. If he has 30 of them in the space of 60 days, then you want to be concerned about that. So the more information, the better. The research is great. We know much more about the causes. We know much more about, the developmental part of it. We certainly know a lot more about how to intervene. Gathering that team early on gives you an opportunity to get the perspectives you need in order to, with your medical professional and other people at the school team, really try to make a designation as to what we're seeing here. And even if there's no identification, but there still are some of the symptoms, it gives you a much better platform to intervene from.
Thank you. And now that that parent has that important information, what are some ways that parents can help their child? And then the second question to that is, how would a parent know that they're helping too much or too little?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that there are a number of things that we can do in the normal course of parenting that allow us to really help kids. One of the first things that I always talk about is giving kids praise and encouragement. And I think sometimes for kids who are complex and are difficult to manage and do things that we don't want them to do, like being impulsive and interrupting and talking over people and taking their siblings' toys and not sharing, not doing all of those things, we tend to try to focus on stopping that behavior, which is certainly something we want to do. But I think the research shows clearly, and in our own practice at our own school, finding an opportunity to praise and encourage this youngster, we used to say at least 10 times a day. Even the youngster who's struggling and struggling and struggling, you can find 10 times a day to say, I really like that. That was something, I know you were frustrated at that point in time, but you calmed down, you worked through it. In the end, you produced a really good product. Be as specific as you possibly can. Be honest. Don't praise things that really don't deserve praise. Kids can see through that right away. So praise and encouragement. Kids with ADHD tend to evoke responses in us as parents. We own one. And so I think earlier on it evokes a response in parents that makes you escalate a little bit too. One of the best things you can do for your child is to stay calm, cool, and collected no matter what's going on. That you be the adult in the room, even though you don't feel like being the adult in the room at that point in time. We also know that providing structure for kids so that they have a reasonably predictable environment, even if they're not necessarily going to abide by that predictable environment, but if there's a reasonable time to go to bed, there's a reasonable time to do homework, and it can be different each day, but provide a structure that the child has a pretty clear idea of what the expectations are going to be and what will happen if the expectations are met, which is hopefully you get a chance to reinforce those things and praise kids, and what might happen if you kind of fall short of the mark or you do something that is not terribly acceptable in the family. So structure, I remember hearing a great quote from Oscar Wilde that says, structure is the last refuge of the unimaginative. And beneath that, somebody had written, well, Oscar never met Billy Wilson, who happened to be a kid who was in our dormitory. So structure was really good for Billy, even though it was the last refuge of the unimaginative. we talk a lot about exercise, and there's good research to suggest that some exercise for kids gives them an opportunity to get some of the energy out and do those sorts of things. It doesn't have to be going to the gym. You can take a walk in the park, you can hike, you can do a variety of other things. It's good anyway, but certainly the research supports that having enough exercise is helpful for kids who have trouble managing being fidgety or managing being impulsive. Good sleep is important. There are lots of studies that suggest that kids with ADHD struggle to sleep at some point in the sleep cycle. And you may want help from your medical professional with that, or somebody who has a lot of information about that. But it's something we should be as intentional about as we possibly can. We should break tasks down for kids. I'm sorry, I have a bunch of these because they're in my head and I've got to get them out.
No, that's perfect.
Okay. I mean, we should break tasks down for kids. These are children who often have times trouble listening and stringing things together. So you ask them to do 4 different things, and they finish one, and they come back and they look at you as though everything's done. And in fact, obviously, there were 3 other things that you wanted them to do. Okay. And so breaking tasks down, giving kids the chunk that they can actually digest and use is also really, really helpful. Kids with ADHD also tend to sort of ready, shoot, aim. Asking them to sort of think things out loud in the home. I'm not necessarily talking about doing that in school, although schools have a way to manage that as well. But having kids sort of pause long enough to sort of think about how they're going to approach this thing and even say it out loud. Go clean your room is a major complex task. But if you say, would you please make your bed, and then would you please brush your teeth, then come back and I have a couple of other things for you to do. You're asking the kid to do something that's a little bit more manageable and not an overwhelming kind of task. Keeping distractions to a minimum, particularly around homework time. Understood has a great series of homework station kind of devices for whatever your home is set up like, that kids who are distracted by a lot of different things, when it comes time to actually sit down and do homework, get it done, get it organized, find the backpack, find those things. If there's a routine and a place, it doesn't matter how big it is, that they can honestly call their own in the evening to sit down and get that done, where they have the materials that they need, there are no distractions, that really helps kids. Kids with ADHD, too, I think, immediately become a little bit resistant and rigid if we sort of command or order them to do something. Okay. They tend to operate a lot better when we explain things. There's a reason why I'm asking you to do this. It's not simply because I'm taller than you are, and therefore you need to do what I want you to do, and I'm the one who prepares your food. But to explain it and get some reasoning behind it usually helps kids quite a bit. And I think for parents themselves, not to get overwhelmed by the fact that this is a constant kind of intervention that's necessary. Kids with ADHD generally have a tremendous amount of energy, far more than their parents do, and it seems like there's a constant barrage of things on particular days that just aren't going the way that the child wants it to go, or certainly that the parent wants it to go. Or parents need to sort of step back and look at the fact that if they're doing a variety of things we just talked about, that over time, most kids with ADHD will become a lot better at the things that we're asking them to do. Try to avoid negative language as much as possible and not qualify things. You never say, I hate you when you do this, or I get so angry when you do this. Talk about the behavior if you want. Don't qualify it with the sort of qualifying it as the child is such. The behavior, yes, you don't want the behavior, but you really don't have to have that kind of negative intervention with kids. You can step back and, again, be the adult in the situation. Pick your battles. If you engage in every single thing that your child with ADHD is likely to do during the day that might irritate you or frustrate you or annoy you a little bit, that's all you're going to do. There are lots of things that kids who don't have ADHD do that we ignore simply because of the fact it's not worth picking the battle at that point in time. Try to be intentional about your interventions. Try to be intentional about your praise. Try to be intentional about your consequences. Try to be intentional about all of the things that you do, looking at the big picture of what you really would like this child to be able to do in order to be successful in your home. So I think that's a good starting point, that those are a fair number of things. Understood, again, has some wonderful advice and lists of things that you can do. So, in the end, if you need if it gets to the point where you need more help, I think it's parents can really help kids with ADHD who are really, really struggling by finding some professional help, whether it's a therapist or a medical professional. We didn't at all talk about medication, and I know for a number of parents, legitimately, that is a big concern and a huge step, but it's part of looking at this overall picture. At some point in time, most parents come to the point where they at least think about that. It's a major decision, should be made with that team again, and in the end made between the parent and the medical professional who might be involved in that. And I will tell you, as a school, we were firm believers in trying just about everything before we went to the possibility of a medication regimen. And for lots of kids that worked. For some kids, the medication was an incredible addition to the intervention program, but it's a decision that needs to be made between parents and trusted medical professionals over a period of time where you get a lot of good information.
Got it. Thanks so much. We do have some parent questions that have come in. So our first question is, how can I help my 10-year-old son feel normal? He has challenges dealing with his ADHD-related issues and keeping up with his non-ADHD friends.
Yeah, I think that's probably the crux of almost all kids with ADHD. When we used to talk to kids about learning disabilities and ADHD, obviously that they were struggling with, almost all of the kids, particularly the young middle school kids, would say, "I just want to be normal. Why can't I be normal?" And I think that for the good part, we can't let ADHD control all of those things, or the fact that this disorder is present and a youngster happens to have ADHD. But I do think that we need to focus on the things that this child does well. And so there are always things that kids do well. And if you, as a parent, if your youngster has 3 or 4 friends who don't happen to have attentional issues, at some point in time, it's really important to try to match what they like to do with what your child likes to do and steer away from the things. If playing video games makes him incredibly frustrated if he can't do it as well as the other kids, inviting 3 kids over to play video games, there's a fair chance that in the end, over time, that may not work out as well as you want to do. But maybe if they go fishing, or they go bowling, or they go to the local library, or whatever they normally like to do as well. I think if you can showcase some of the things that your child with ADHD does well, both to other kids and to adults, then you put them in a position where kids begin to change their view, want to spend more time because they don't have unpredictable or unreliable behavior happening with this youngster. They're seeing him at his best. And if they see him at his best over time, it's easier for them to see him when he's not at his best. And I think that the more we can do that, you can't make that happen all the time, but you can also engage the school in this. Many schools are very willing to create groups of kids who spend some time together, or kids with special needs who like 2 or 3 other kids. They set up a lunch where kids can have lunch together that's monitored by a trusted faculty member or trusted counselor. So again, this youngster can be viewed in a way that's very positive. The conversation can be steered to things that he likes. If he knows a lot about baseball, we can talk about baseball. So I think that, kids without ADHD are much better at both understanding and accepting that their friend, who they like very much, struggles with some different things. One of the things I think we found at our school was that our kids were far more tolerant and accepting of kids than we thought they were going to be. And so I really think that try to do the things that makes your child look normal, the things that he's good at, the things that he likes. He doesn't have to be a star at any of them, but things that he likes to spend time with. There are kids with ADHD who will play Legos for 6 hours comfortably with other kids, sharing things and doing those things because they're hyper-focused on the task and they're good at it. So I think the short answer to this is try to focus on the things your child does well, encourage those interests, make opportunities. It might be that the people are at your house more than you'd like them to be, but create opportunities that work where you can be, monitoring things and step in if you need to, but where there's a fair chance that these strengths, and all kids have lots of strengths, these strengths are going to be on display, which makes the needs or the issues less important.
Got it. Thank you, Mark. Our next question. My son was recently diagnosed with ADHD. He also has anxiety. Do the two always go hand in hand?
It's certainly something that we see in a lot of kids with ADHD, and I think that it almost stands to reason, and that is that kids have trouble predicting their own behavior if they happen to have ADHD. They have trouble controlling impulses. They have trouble with self-regulation. They're not necessarily great at new kinds of different things that are happening with them in school or changing routines and doing those kinds of things. And for some kids, that creates an anxiety that exacerbates the ADHD. And many times we see kids who are that anxious, very frustrated and become angry and scared. And we tend to see that externalized in a lot of kids. It can be internalized as well, for sure. Okay. So I think, again, the answer is that it is not uncommon at all for kids who have been identified with ADHD to have varying levels of anxiety. Having the team really understand the nature of this anxiety as much as possible and being able to intervene. Sometimes it's as simple as, when the child is really anxious, giving him a calm place with a trusted adult that he can go to, not for the day, but for 5 or 10 minutes. It also means that, parents can become the ultimate observers and, again, begin to link these common threads of what sorts of sets of conditions produce anxiety. If you're going to a new place, if you're going to an extended family gathering around Thanksgiving, and there are lots of people there, some of whom your youngster doesn't see very often, and, sort of backing away from that and talking about what the day will look like and who's going to be there and, who you're going to sit next to and what the activities are going to be. As much as we can predict things for this youngster, we're going to help him alleviate the anxiety. But for some kids, it's crushing. It is as debilitating as any other part of the disorder, and we need to pay attention to that and get the kind of help we need if it's there. But I would say in a good number of kids who happen to have ADHD, that there is likely to be a noticeable and persistent kind of anxiety.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Our next question comes from Evan. Evan says, my son is a freshman in college and was just diagnosed with ADHD. How can we support him when he isn't under our roof every day?
Yeah, the best thing to do is to be very sure about what the support services are at the school. And while things change a bit after you get out from under the umbrella of K through 12, it certainly is evident in most college campuses that I would say almost all colleges have support services of some kind. It will be critical for either your youngster at age 18 or 19 or you to partner with a support services group in a variety of different ways. And again, I think that going in and letting people know that you do have ADHD. That is certainly a covered disorder, and that colleges see a lot of kids who happen to have attentional issues, and many of them are very, very good at managing that and helping kids and paving the way with professors and things to have things presented in a little bit different way. You are entitled, certainly, to accommodations. You will likely have to create and produce a paper trail that says if it was a recent identification, then obviously the information will be recent enough, because they want some kind of indication that a qualified professional has participated in this. But I think our experience has been, particularly in the last 10 years, thank goodness, that most colleges have become very, very good on the accommodation side. And I think they've done a lot of good work with their faculties, so that their faculty members, so that they indeed have a better understanding of what accommodations really look like. And that accommodations are meant to level the playing field. They're not meant to give anybody an advantage. But the first step would really be to go to the support services office, find out what they have available, what they need from the parents and the student in order to take a look and see whether he is eligible for services under the support services program, and make sure, because the one thing that colleges don't seem to be all that good at doing is chasing you down. Make sure that you avail yourself of the services once somebody decides that you are eligible for those kind of services. It can make a world of difference. It can make an overwhelming, unpredictable environment where, you know, you go to school for 15 hours a week, you take 5 courses, 3 hours a week, as opposed to high school where you went to school for a whole day and you had structure around you and study halls and those sorts of things. Make sure once you get established with the support services group that you indeed take advantage of it. There are loads of kids who have attentional issues who have been highly successful in college using support services that make some sense.
Thank you, Mark. Our next question comes from Janine. Janine says, my son has intense meltdowns. The most effective strategy is to intervene at the first stages, but sometimes it's unavoidable. Do you have ideas for how to calm ADHD children down?
Well, I think she raises a great question about meltdowns versus tantrums, and what to do in those sorts of things. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about tantrums versus meltdowns. And, you know, tantrums tend to associate them with younger kids and figure, depending on who you read, by the time they get to 7 or 8, those should have gone away, and kids should be able to withstand a little frustration and manage things. But, you know, tantrums tend to have some control associated with them, so that the child, while he is, you know, tired and hungry and whatever, has a tantrum, it's usually in a little shorter duration. You might be able to intervene more effectively earlier on. Nice, calm voices, hand on the shoulder, moving you from one place to another, all of those things. In a true meltdown, kids have just really lost control. They're either so frustrated or so angry, even if the thing that's making them that way is not significant enough to produce that kind of a reaction, that if you are lucky enough, and the mom sounds like she's been pretty successful in the early stages, understanding what the triggers are, and maybe creating a signal for the child that says, look, I kind of think you're escalating. Why don't we step out of this for a second? Let's go to another room. Let's sit down and chat. And for some kids at the early stages, that can be wonderful. When you get into a full-blown kind of meltdown where there's nothing that you can do at the moment to get a response that makes some sense, you're just a lot of yelling and screaming and sobbing and throwing stuff and doing all those kinds of things, the first thing to do is really make sure everybody's safe, that this youngster is not going to throw a toy train at somebody and hit him in the head with it inadvertently, not on purpose, just because they're a little out of control. And then meltdowns end usually with the child being exhausted from the meltdown, and eventually things wind their way back down, or a parent is lucky enough to intervene effectively, or teacher lucky enough to intervene effectively, that things begin to de-escalate a little bit. It's probably most important to make sure you're safe, make sure the child understands that you're going to be there with them during this. You're not necessarily going to demand that it stops if it can't stop at that point in time. It's sort of the aftermath that is the really important thing, in terms of trying to get a sense of, what that trigger was, what the escalation was, how can I help you before that time. And again, this particular mom seems like she's had some success with doing that. But I think we need to understand that when kids get into a really true, full-blown meltdown, the chances of intervening effectively, other than making sure that they're safe and they understand that you're seeing this as a behavior, it's not a qualification of them not being a good kid, but obviously you want to help them begin to manage this more effectively and to stop it as the escalation goes up. And so sometimes if you have enough of these, you obviously want to seek professional help as well. But kids can be more insightful, I think, than we think they can be sometimes. And so kids can tell you, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and all those three things just made me really angry and really frustrated, and I blew up.
Got it.
So that trying to find those triggers, trying to develop a signal that the child understands and likes, whatever it happens to be. For a lot of kids, it's visual and auditory as well. So they're hearing you both, seeing you tug your earlobe, and you're saying, gosh, I really think that this is getting a little bit out of hand. Use the words that you choose with the child on a consensus basis to start that process. So that I think that for kids who truly have meltdowns, getting at it early is helpful, but not all the time. And the aftermath is more helping this child sort out with you what the triggers were, how you as a parent might be able to a little bit better help them not get to the point where the escalation is so quick that it's 0 to 100 before anybody can take a breath.
Got it. Thank you. We do have room for one more question. So our next question comes from Megan. Megan says, my son is 12 and has ADHD and anxiety. Though we certainly have some time, what are you seeing with employers and how they are welcoming and understanding of those with ADHD?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think it varies by who the employers happen to be.
Okay.
And I think that we find that if you think about this, I think there was a study done, I can't remember whether it was 10 or 11 years ago, might even been a little bit longer, that fully 50+% of the CEOs of large American companies are people with attentional issues. They're great thinkers. They move quickly. They have great ideas, and then they let other people sort out what the details are. So there are places where kids with attentional issues who finish school in some sort of way and go into the environment can certainly be very, very successful. Choosing what to do and choosing how you approach thinking about what you'd really like to do and making sure the match is as good as possible, I think is really important. But I think that many, many employers and the Poses Family Foundation is certainly in some of its work, working with employers to have them both recognize and embrace the value added of people who happen to have struggles and disorders in some point in time successfully. It has certainly placed a lot of people. That matchup is really important, and finding something that is really in line with how you think and how you operate. When you think about people who like a lot of stimulation and like things to change and like things to be interesting, as you're looking for a job, you probably don't want to go into piecework somewhere where you're assembling something that's the same again and again and again. But I do think that the industries themselves that benefit from bright, creative people with great ideas have found ways to accommodate people's attentional issues effectively, and that has helped the bottom line of those companies. And so I'd love to say they're doing it just because they're nice people, but I really think that they're doing it because it is value added, and their businesses are doing better because of the matchups they've done with people with attentional issues who happen to have a ton of talent.
Thank you, Mark, so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today's chat. I do want to remind those joining us that if you had a question that we were unable to get to, please feel free to visit our community at u.org/community, where those questions can be answered then. Thank you all again for joining us.